As a person who'd never played a game in the series, I never really understood what the hype was about. From what I'd seen and heard, these games didn't really sound all that great, honestly, but I decided to give Dark Souls 3 Church here, and welcome to the Game Grinder. Today we'll be reviewing Dark Souls 3. Dark Souls 3 was developed by From Software, who also developed the previous Dark Souls games, but also Demon Souls, Bloodborne, Kingsfield, and some others. Though at this time I didn't share the upcoming anticipation for Dark Souls 3, I've been considerably interested in giving a game in the series a fair chance after my short time spent with Bloodborne over a year ago, which were actually the first videos I did on my channel besides my introduction. Dark Souls 3 was released in April of 2016 for the PlayStation 4, Xbox One, and PC. I played the game on the PS4. A bell has chimed, echoing the last days of the First Flame, the source of power keeping this world in its age of fire, where death becomes undeath, staving off the age of darkness, where fire no longer burns and all light has died out. The Lords of Cinder, who had been chosen to relight this flame, have fled, and now as the Unkindled, we arise from our graves to return the Lords of Cinder to their thrones, and choose the fate of the Kingdom of Lothric. And so our journey begins. To start off this review, I'm going to toss in a disclaimer of sorts. I'm going to talk about all the usual things that I do in my reviews, but Dark Souls 3 and the Souls series in general are incredibly complex with its mechanics and story, so I'll be hitting on the main areas of focus, but in respect of how the game doesn't explain itself and encourages us, the player, to figure out everything by trial and error, I'm going to leave some of those elements out. Dark Souls 3's gameplay continues on just as all other series entries have. It's an action role-playing game in the third-person perspective. The primary bulk of the gameplay takes part in exploration and progression through the game's many regions, with many branching paths. I feel like I use this comparison way too much, but think of it as a 3D Metroidvania, where we are free to explore in any way we want, but many paths require keys to be found, switches to be activated, or other special requirements to make use of said routes. Many of these branching paths are optional, but may contain quest progression encounters, and all sorts of fat loots to be had, and we'll use the loot as a segue into the game's RPG mechanics. The Souls series has a very strong emphasis on playing the game how we decide to play the game. From the start, we'll choose how we want our character to look, and choose a class, or not, to help focus our character's abilities in a playstyle we're aiming for. Want to be an armored fighter with a sword and shield? A fast and stealthy thief? How about a spellcaster? Pick one of these and not loving it? Not a problem, since as we progress and level our character, we can adjust skills and points in enough ways that really until you're shooting for a high level or endgame build, there's really no wrong choice. And switching from one skill focus to another requires just hitting a few attribute requirements and using the right gear to get the job done. As we defeat enemies, complete goals, or find souls to harvest, we'll gain souls. Souls are the universal currency for the game, allowing us to level up an attribute, purchase gear and upgrades as well. When leveling, instead of gaining a level and boosting all attributes like strength, vitality, dexterity, and so on, we choose one to increase, which increases our overall level. This gives us a lot of flexibility for us to adjust our playstyle as we progress, and learn more of what we can and cannot do, and focus on the skills that benefit us directly. You can do some serious min-max builds, which can lead to some interesting characters. Now back to the loot itself. A lot of who we decide to be in this game depends on the gear we choose to use. Everything directly correlates to how the character can handle said gear. Playing a heavily armored, great shield, massive hammer-wielding warrior is going to be quite a tank, but with all this weight we'll be slow and lumbering with attacks. Focusing on strength and vitality are going to be important, compared to say a spellcaster who would instead focus on intelligence, faith, or attunement. Going that route won't necessarily allow a caster to wear heavy gear, as items may have level requirements by whichever attribute, just like a fighter might not have the requirements to use a staff. I cannot stress enough how this game really caters to allowing us to build our characters in whatever way we want, so it's also entirely possible to have a heavily armored caster of whatever flavor we want. Dark Souls 3 has a huge emphasis on loot. Besides all sorts of helpful items, the weapons and armor are a huge piece of the game. Weapons range from small daggers to massive greatswords, axes, and spears. We can use a shield if we like, or instead dual wield a weapon, or even use two hands. Seriously, the amount of depth in the weapon system is pretty impressive. With the weapons, of course, is the armor. From naked to heavy plating, again, what we decide to use reflects directly on the playstyle we'd like to use. Much of the gear will be found while exploring or defeating enemies, but we may also purchase a large amount of this from the NPCs we'll encounter in our hub area, the Firelink Shrine. I mentioned that many times gear will have requirements to use, and associated tributes such as strength needed to wield a giant weapon, but in the end though, in regards to gear, sacrificing the speed of a dodge roll for some extra defense points is usually going to lead to a bad time. What point is crazy gear without enemies to unleash wrath upon? Well, do I got news for you, buddy. The Souls series is infamous for its wide range of enemy types, and none of them are easy for a first encounter. Dark Souls 3 is an incredibly challenging game, but not overly difficult if we take the time to understand our obstacles. It harkens back to the trial and error days of the original Nintendo, where a first battle with an enemy type may result in a quick death, but once learning its maneuvers and how to effectively defeat it now gives us the knowledge to dispatch said enemies with ease in future encounters, and you will have plenty of opportunity to practice. Throughout all the regions of Lothric are hordes of undead creatures and demons waiting to make us their next victim, and the sheer variety was impressive to me as it's too common these days for enemies to be recycled throughout later stages of the game, but Dark Souls 3 does a great job at providing a ton of variety which adds so much to its world. Of course, besides our standard foes, we'll encounter many area bosses, and this is where the game can ramp up its challenge. Each boss can be thought of as a puzzle, with them telegraphing their attacks, and will be required to pay attention to cues and react fast when needed to in order to survive. With this overbearing danger, we do not have to face the darkness alone. Dark Souls 3 includes a very unique cooperative and versus multiplayer function that's quite neat. Early on, we'll be able to make use of an item called an Ember, which when used, will not only boost our character's hit points and give us a kindled appearance, but allow us to summon other players for help, or invade other players to attack, or be invaded by others. This adds a lot of interesting mechanics to an already deep game. Feeling a bit desolate in our travels? Summon a Sunbro for company, and sometimes more than one even. Summoning allies for a boss battle can be the difference between a recurring death and a swift victory, but remaining embered comes at a cost. This gives other players the opportunity to invade us, and potentially prevent us from successfully making our way to the next bonfire, aka checkpoint. Depending on an area, it may be unwise to ember up as certain joinable factions may act as defenders of specific areas, or even just the wandering anarchists might want to try to ruin our day for shits and giggles. I'm going to quickly mention that though Dark Souls has a significant focus on its gameplay, the story is by no means insignificant. Dark Souls 3 is steeped in lore, and much of this is told indirectly, through item descriptions and environmental cues. This information can be as light or as heavy as we want it to be, and again this comes directly from the developers allowing us to play the game in a manner we choose to. It doesn't force the subtle or nuanced elements of the world down our throats, but will let the monsters we face use sharp objects to do that instead. Because of this, I'm going to be incredibly brief with my story summary. So with that said, I will be mentioning some minor spoilers, so if you'd like to skip ahead, skip to the time listed or go ahead and click on the annotation. Let's move on then. As the Ashen One, once meeting the Firekeeper, we are tasked with tracking down the Lords of Cinder and returning them, or most of them, to their shrines in order to become a Lord of Cinder ourselves and relight the first flame. We'll visit many different regions during our pursuit, from the high walls of a castle, to a rotten swamp, dungeons, an ancient city, and many other unique locations. As we defeat each Lord of Cinder, we'll remove their heads, which are then to be placed onto their thrones. After this long and grueling task has been completed, our next choice lies in front of us. Dark Souls 3 has 4 different game endings, and the outcomes are quite different. Do we wish to relight the flame and continue the cycle? Fancy yourself the one true Lord of Cinder? Perhaps Ruler sounds appealing. What if we extinguish the flame? These are choices we'll have to make in the end, and there's not necessarily a right or wrong choice, but I think one of the endings seems much more canon to the story than the others. No review of Dark Souls 3 is complete without a mention of the game's challenge. I already spoke briefly about this, but I'd like to elaborate a little bit more. You might hear a lot of people going on about how difficult the games are, and honestly that's very misleading. The way people boast this difficulty make the game seem very dependent on a player's skill, and that's further from the truth than anything. Dark Souls 3 requires an understanding of its combat mechanics, and how to approach each new enemy we encounter, but then boils down to using this understanding to overcome these obstacles. If you can grasp the battle mechanics quickly, the challenge will not seem as intimidating as claims make it out to be. My best comparison would be its difficulty leans more towards that of a puzzle game, instead of difficulty like an online first-person shooter. And as I mentioned before, when the going gets tough, summon aid. So on to the game's presentation. For the current generation of games I've played so far, besides Metal Gear Solid 5 The Phantom Pain, Dark Souls 3 is a shining example of next-gen graphics. This game looks absolutely incredible, and many of the scenic vistas are almost breathtaking to look at. The amount of detail in all the areas and the enemy designs, on top of all the unique gear and weapons, is nothing short of impressive. From Software has done a fantastic job of delivering a visual experience to perfectly match the moods and situations we find ourselves in, and really drives home the concept of a dying world being overtaken by evil. To amplify this experience, we're provided with a beautiful soundtrack that highlights the highs and lows, excitement and mystery of the Dark Souls 3 journey. Motoi Sakuraba and Yuka Kitamura should be commended for their contributions, and it's very uncommon for AAA releases to truly have soundtracks that resonate with me after some time of completing a game. With all this glowing praise of Dark Souls 3, there was really one notable negative that stood out to me, and my views on this probably differ quite a bit from the rest of the community. The most negative criticism I have is the game's extreme obscurity, not only for its story, but the mechanics as well. At the beginning, it will cover basic control through displayed messages, but after that there is no information provided. It's a lot of trial and error, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, but there are some very specific instances where performing an action or using an item can completely shut off quests or events, and there's no way of knowing. If you want access to all the side areas, this is pretty much impossible without using a guide, and that's always been a major pet peeve of mine when it comes to RPGs. I don't need to be spoon-fed, but at least give me a clue or a nudge in the right direction can make all the difference. I understand this is a large piece of the game's replayability, but after spending 30 hours working towards a specific ending of the game, only to have it cut off by a stupid irreversible mistake that was caused by a very trolling-like message from another player was incredibly frustrating. With that said, and regardless of being that said, holy shit was Dark Souls 3 awesome. I'm seriously disappointed in not playing this series beforehand, but as I said before, people do a really poor job of reviewing this game. The get good thing is funny when it's used as a joke, but I think a lot of people take it way too seriously when talking about this game. Nobody could sell me on this game, and that's really close friends included. But it was actually Jim Sterling, a games journalist and commentator, that sold me on it with his video Prepare to Die. I don't believe I've made any better efforts to review this than anybody else, but if you're on the fence, check out his video. So final thoughts. Wow. I can usually call it pretty well, but Dark Souls 3 annihilated my expectations, and I loved every minute I spent during my 50-hour playthrough. I scoured every inch of every area, defeated every boss, and when it was over, I immediately jumped into New Game Plus mode for more. With amazing visuals and a matching soundtrack, more depth to gameplay that one can shake a stick at, and a truly immersive, engaging, and yet wholly obscure story, I couldn't possibly recommend Dark Souls 3 more. I'm looking forward to a possible contender to usurp Dark Souls 3's best game of the year that I've added to it already. Thanks for checking out my review of Dark Souls 3. What were your thoughts on the game? Let me know in the comments below. If you liked what you've seen or heard, please give the video a like, a share, and subscribe to see future videos. I'm on Facebook and Twitter as well, and I post a lot of other great game-related content there, and of course links are in the description. Until next time on the Game Grinder.